Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Fire Breathing Rob. Thank you for listening to us on YouTube, and please subscribe and also share these videos. If you're listening to us on the 10 radio stations that play our interviews, thanks so much. I'm going to get right into this. I have on, and we've had him on the program. This is the second time on, Shahid Buttar. He is running for Congress against, I think, the evil Nancy Pelosi in California 12. And we really hope Shahid wins because, honestly, in this time, in this crisis, we need more progressive leaders. So, Shahid, thanks so much for coming on the program again. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's always good to be with you.
So what have you done to change the operations of the campaign?
So the pandemic certainly has thrown a wrench, I think, in everyone's works. And for us on the campaign, the very first thing we did was suspend voter outreach to focus on mutual aid. We recognize that people in our community here in San Francisco were just dealing with things other than politics. So for the first month after the shelter-in-place order first dropped, we really focused our volunteers and our staff on calling first volunteers and then voters just to see how people were doing and to make sure they had information about where, for instance, they could get a free meal or how they could qualify for different benefits that the city government and various nonprofits had made available. And while we were doing that, recognizing that the public health crisis made canvassing and events unsafe, we put together digital tools to enable the expansion, the scale of our phone banking operation. So in the last few weeks since we relaunched our phone banking operation, we've trained hundreds of volunteers from coast to coast. Anybody, anywhere is welcome to jump in. Shahid.fyi/volunteer is an easy way to find yourself to the sign-up form. And we'd be eager to include any of your listeners who are interested in, particularly to speak about the pandemic, not from the standpoint of our campaign really quickly, but just our civilization. It is absolutely preposterous that we do not have universal health care in this country, at least as an emergency response to a pandemic. It was long the case that we have allocated healthcare resources barbarically to the people who can pay the most instead of the people who need the most. Of all the things to allocate according to exchange instead of need, healthcare makes the least sense. And the pandemic makes that inescapably clear because we all share an interest, especially in a contagious pandemic, in making sure that all of our neighbors can get care. The pretense that healthcare is a commodity good that individuals contract for from private providers with no externalities, no impacts on our neighbors, it's stupid, frankly. And it's bizarre to me. I mean, I understand entirely too well corporate corruption is the answer why we don't have the same human rights in this country that other people in other countries do. But living in a land of the free and a home of the supposedly brave, I hope that we, the people of the United States, demonstrate our bravery by shrugging off the yoke of a stale, predatory corporate system that is driving us into the graves en masse, and establish at least universal health care to make sure we can see it through this pandemic with as many Americans alive as we can.
The $1,200 that was passed, you look at places where you are, San Francisco, I'm in Orlando too. We've talked about with you last interview about affordable housing and how that's a huge crisis in San Francisco, Orlando, New York City, and all the cities, big cities around the country. You can't pay rent, get food with $1,000 with people that are making minimum wage jobs. It's a total joke. So with that said, what was your opinion on the stimulus? It seemed like a corporate giveaway to me where the big businesses made out and the rich people made out, but working people didn't get crap. They got the crumbs.
It certainly got the crumbs. And you're absolutely right that it was yet another corporate bailout. I want to contrast it with the 2008 TARP corporate bailout because there are actually some reasons for to recognize progress. At the same time that I agree with you in broad strokes, it was entirely too deferential to corporate interests. And $1,200 in San Francisco, if you're paying the average price for a one bedroom, that's not quite 2 weeks rent. So it doesn't even get you a full month's rent, doesn't get you food, doesn't get you healthcare. It's not enough by a long shot for anybody to do anything. But if we contrast this with the TARP bailout in 2008, the banks got something on the order of $600 billion without any payments at all going to working Americans. And this measure at least included, alongside a $500 billion corporate slush fund for our corrupt criminal president, it did at least include hundreds of millions of dollars in direct payments to Americans. Now, I want to contrast the one-time $1,200 payment that some Americans got with the $1.6 million in tax relief enjoyed by 43,000 millionaires around the country. And the idea that we're passing tax cuts for millionaires at all, let alone in a pandemic stimulus response bill, it's offensive. And I want to contrast that another amount. The money that we showered in the tax breaks for millionaires, which Nancy Pelosi supported, is greater than the amount that Congress spent on hospitals. That is unconscionable. If you're going to pass a tax break for millionaires, at least do it in the open. Call the bill something about tax breaks for millionaires. Have a debate. Don't shoehorn it into an emergency stimulus package responding to the needs of a population in crisis. Further, there's another bill that hasn't passed the House yet. It has been proposed, particularly by Representative Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. She's a member of the squad, someone I admire very much, and I'm very eager to support when I join the body. In Congress, her bill to cancel the rent, to suspend mortgage and rent payments, would also not only allow working class Americans to stay in their homes during this time of unprecedented economic crisis, but it also provides stimulus payments to small landlords so that people who rent out a room in their house or maybe have a second home but are not corporate landlords, that they also have some support. This is exactly the people's bailout that Nancy Pelosi has stood in the way of, and why Nancy Pelosi is showering tax breaks on millionaires. She wants, her latest proposal here is to bail out corporate lobbyists, including big pharma, the particular corporate lobbyists that inhibit us from having universal health care, which is just layers upon layers of gross, frankly. I mean, it adds corruption and self-interest to the deprivation of human rights for a population en masse during a time when we particularly need them. And I do think that the distributive justice, or the distributive injustice, I should say, embedded in the coronavirus stimulus response packages are all the more reason that San Francisco needs a new voice in Congress.
How do you feel like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has handled the pandemic compared to Donald Trump? I saw and you can tell me if this is all over the state, I saw that a lot of the homeless people in Los Angeles were being put in hotels, which I think is the right thing to do, as far as, we want to make sure that they're, in homes in general, but at least they're in hotels right now and they're not on the streets. Is that happening all around California? And also the handling of California's pandemic compared to how the Trump administration has handled it?
So Governor Newsom, certainly relative to our corrupt criminal president, has demonstrated far and away a better response to the pandemic. I've rarely been as grateful to live in California as I have over the last several weeks. We were one of the first states, and frankly, the counties surrounding San Francisco, the entire Bay Area, were some of the first jurisdictions in the country to announce shelter-in-place orders. I do want to give credit where due there. It's not to our mayor, but rather to the county officials in the surrounding counties. Our mayor tried to scoop them by announcing our shelter-in-place order before the local jurisdictions had agreed to, which was disappointing and reflected a little bit of the political gamesmanship, that we see. It is unfortunate to see both Trump and our mayor, attempt to politicize the crisis, either by claiming credit for their response or by, trying to, after the fact, brag about the number of tests after, ducking into the punch of the pandemic at every opportunity. Donald Trump's response to the pandemic initially was to ignore it, say it was going away, throw his hands in the air, shut down flights from China while leaving them open to Europe, and basically inundating the East Coast with contagion. He, particularly by dismantling the agencies and intergovernment bodies that were responsible for preparing for pandemics, by defunding the WHO, by refusing to follow the guidance, more recently by pressing to reopen states before the curve has even flattened. I mean, honestly, it's absurd. The idea that Americans are going to be forced back to work in the service of supporting an economy while placing their lives and their families at risk. My outrage grows. It might seem like I am too outraged too often, but there are entirely too many reasons for outrage at the moment, and that is one of them. When we talk about opening states, the point there, the reason the right wing wants to open states is to force people off unemployment rolls if they refuse to go to work. And as long as it's unsafe to go to work, you shouldn't have to go to work, period. And workers deserve workplace safety. If employers can't provide that, that's what the government's for. And it's exactly what Donald Trump has so miserably failed to provide. The shelter-in-place orders coming in early here in California was important. A couple places where we frankly failed miserably included executing the program to get homeless folks into hotels. It's not just the case that we need to get shelter for our unhoused neighbors to diminish contagion vectors. It's also the case that the hotel industries across California have been decimated by the pandemic. So this is a win-win. It helps the hotels, it helps our communities, helps our unhoused neighbors, and it helps flatten the curve. And at the same time that we have the policy in place, here in San Francisco, our city officials have been dragging their feet getting people into those hotels. So it took weeks for that to happen. You know, the initial plans were to house them in congregate housing, contrary to the public health guidance. I'm grateful that there's been an evolution here. The Mayor London Breed has come to see the wisdom of moving people into hotels. I'm grateful for Governor Gavin Newsom's leadership in being on the early side of the curve among government officials to figure out how to respond to this crisis. And I do want to make the point that at the federal level, Donald Trump's failures are appropriately laid at the feet of figures including Nancy Pelosi. Part of the reason that Donald Trump is still in office is because she showed up for impeachment like a boxer throwing a fight. You know, she showed up halfway through the process a year late and then limited the process to excuse the president's corruption, which was the one issue that could have swung right-wing support and shaken loose potential votes from GOP senators. And that's exactly what Pelosi didn't want to pursue. It's why the president is still in office. And unfortunately, it's one of the reasons that tens of thousands of Americans are in their graves at the moment. It is a really somber moment to reflect on politics. More Americans have died in the last 2.5 months than in 19 years in Vietnam. It took us 19 years in Vietnam to kill as many Americans as Donald Trump did in the last 2.5 months. And, you know, again, the reasons for outrage are entirely too many.
We saw President Trump and a lot of these governors, as you just spoke about, do want to open up the economies. They want to open up these states, but it seems like they're more worried about the economy than people's health. And also that it's an election year and the president is up for re-election doesn't help. With that said, what is your take on opening it up?
I mean, it's certainly an invitation to disaster. You know, I do wish that people took more seriously, particularly what we're seeing out of New York City. That is the experience we can expect in other cities that open too early. We don't have herd immunity. We don't have a vaccine. It's a lot about this virus we don't know. We do know that it kills a lot of people. We know that it's miserable even for people who survive. And we know that we shouldn't take it lightly. The idea that we would put the economy before the lives of people, it's not acceptable. And it's also unsurprising. We have long made those decisions. In fact, our entire healthcare system is predicated on the idea of putting the interests of pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies before the interests of patients. That is our formal public policy. And yes, that is unacceptable. It's absurd. It's preposterous, but it's what you get. It's the Congress that we have bought and paid for, or alternatively that the corporations have bought and paid for. You know, I'll recall Michael Bloomberg's admission in one of the Democratic debates that when Democrats won the House, that he bought that, and he did buy that. That is a fair description of our body politic and how it works. Yeah, I think it's crazy to open too soon. I really do hope. The idea that some Americans would be protesting for the right to race into our graves to save an economy that serves corporate masters and the 0.1% is that I will describe not as outrageous. I'll describe that as really just profoundly disappointing and sad that so many people are so unaware and ignorant either of the facts or their own interests that they would invite such self-marginalizing outcomes. And I just would invite people who think that they, you know, that the liberty is at stake here or that their freedom is being diminished, just to, you know, consider the freedom of, you know, your last days dying alone in an intensive care unit. You know, that doesn't sound like a very free outcome to me. And, you know, given particularly the possibility of asymptomatic transmission, it is absolutely imperative on all of us to guard each other by, at the moment, following the public health guidance and staying at home.
I want to talk about your opponent. And, you know, we've talked about healthcare throughout this interview, but I think this needs to be said. Congresswoman Pelosi and the Democratic Party are pushing COBRA and opening up Obamacare in a pandemic. I know you believe that Medicare for all is the better route, But why are these people still pushing Obamacare and the COBRA, which is extremely expensive to pay for the majority of people, instead of a winning issue? We saw in Mississippi when even Senator Sanders, he got blown out in Mississippi, but Medicare for All was 60% approval rating in Mississippi. In every Democratic primary, we've seen Medicare for All at least at 55 to 60%. So why is Congresswoman Pelosi and also the Democratic Party pushing these two other issues instead of what we need?
Right. Well, you noted that it is very expensive for people, which is exactly why they're pushing it. Expensive for people means lucrative for business. And Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic Party aren't terribly democratic. They're a corporate party, and they put corporate interests first. And nowhere, frankly, is that more immediately apparent than in the party's unfortunate commitment to predatory for-profit healthcare. And this is true in a couple different, ways to think about. One way to think of it is that because we force people to pay for pharmaceuticals without the collective purchasing power of the government, that we have an artificial subsidy for pharmaceutical companies built into our federal policy. And that's not a subsidy that the government is paying. That's a subsidy that patients are paying, forced by the government to negotiate on an individuated basis. Now, contrast that with labor unions. When we bargain together, we get better outcomes. That's why labor unions exist. So you can bargain for better wages. The government's purchasing power and a Medicare for All universal single payer system leverages that consumer purchasing power. Even if you think of it through the lens of conventional economics, even if you're not a socialist, it still makes sense. Another way to think about this is the longest lever for job stimulus that we could imagine. There's no cost confronting American businesses, by and large, larger than employee healthcare, and particularly the employee healthcare in the pension obligation context. If we nationalize that obligation, it would immediately improve the balance sheets of every business in America. Nothing would be more likely to lead to a boom in job creation, which incidentally we might need given the pandemic and the way that that's created a spike in unemployment. There's another piece here in terms of the way that that for-profit health insurance and pharmaceutical companies bleed patients dry and empty their wallets when they are sick and forces them into the street, literally. The leading cause of homelessness and bankruptcy are medical bills. There's no reason for that. When people are sick, the last thing that we should force them to worry about is how to keep a roof over their head. We are better than that, and we should act better than that, and we can. And the key to that is the Medicare for All bill proposed by Representative Jayapal. I think it's absurd that Nancy Pelosi hasn't seen fit to bring it to the floor of the House. I think it's unacceptable. It's one of the reasons why I'm running to replace her. And it is, you made this point, Medicare for All is an object of bipartisan consensus across the United States. Yet our corporate members of Congress don't support the measure. In that juxtaposition is an indictment of our process itself. And the answer, I think, reveals itself. The answer is because our members of Congress don't represent us. They represent capital. And it's obvious by how they legislate. And one reason I'm running for Congress is to help democratize, to liberate, you might say, the United States. I think that we have opportunities, if we recover our democracy, to expand human rights. Ensuring a universal right to healthcare is at the top of my agenda.
Shahid Buttar, he's running for California 12 against Nancy Pelosi here on Fire Breathing Rob. I was watching Jimmy Dore a couple of days, and I know you've been on his show before. And he had a clip, and it got pretty good views on his YouTube channel. And it was about 60 Minutes, and it was a show in 2008 where 60 Minutes did a segment on Nancy Pelosi that she had a shady stock deal when she was Speaker of the House, when Barack Obama was running for office. For presidency.
This was the Visa IPO, right?
Yes, the 8. She invested in 8 IPOs rather, and with that she bought Visa, and she bought 5,000 shares at $44 a piece. They went up to $64 a piece, and you kind of get the story in 4 days. And then she stalled, and during those 4 days, she stalled credit card legislation. So we talk about the corruption, and you've brought it up many times in this interview, and this is either fishy at best, and at worst, she's a criminal for doing this. So why isn't this stuff, really come out? I mean, we saw it on Jimmy Dore's, and a lot of progressives know this, but this is not on the mainstream media.
So it is certainly reflective of corruption. I'd say that, you know, part of the problem here is that the law doesn't recognize it as criminal, even though it should. You know, we are talking about open corruption. And the idea that the Speaker of the House is going to suppress credit reform legislation while profiting from a credit card company's IPO, again, just to the same extent as, you know, privileging the interests of health insurance companies or pharma companies over patients. It's putting business interests before the interests of her constituents, of San Franciscans, and of we the people of the United States. It's entirely too consistent with a pattern that we absolutely should not accept. To the point about why more people don't recognize it, you know, this I'd say is a question about the media landscape and, unfortunately, corporate rule and consolidation. We don't have anything resembling an impartial media. We tend to have weaponized media sources. You know, the outrage plays well to audiences, advertising creates unfortunate dynamics. You have Fox News as a propaganda outlet for the right wing. You have MSNBC as a propaganda outlet for the centrist institutional Democratic Party. Like, where will you find truth? Usually for me, from independent outlets, you know, like your own. I think it's important for people to proactively curate your news sources at a time like this. We can't just accept whatever we're spoon-fed and accept it as truth. This is absolutely a time to be critically thinking, and to be engaged as more than just passive consumers of our news. It's entirely too unmoored from the facts at the moment. And so it's important that people conduct their own investigations and come to examine facts that might not be delivered, particularly by the cable TV news outlets, you know, that settle for so much fluff instead of meaningful content about the issues of the day.
I want to talk about the 2020 campaign with Bernie Sanders. You know, a lot of progressives, and I supported Bernie in 2016 and 2020, but a lot of progressives do feel like Bernie left them at the altar. And in this moment of a pandemic, we need progressive policies. You also see, you know, Joe Biden's hiding in his house. He's doing, you know, if he does interviews, it's with The View or these softball interviews where they don't even ask him any tough questions. We need New Deal policies, as I just said. And we also see this baggage now with the Tara Reade instance where, you know, the Democrats believe what they want to believe with women, but when it hurts their candidate, they say, oh, it's not true, and they support their candidate when not even the facts have came out in this. Yeah. So, and we'll also see the son's business deals with Joe Biden's and his record against Trump with the TPP. He supported it, Joe Biden did. The crime bill, he voted for the war in Iraq. He wants to cut Social Security. The list goes on and on. So what do you feel about the Bernie 2020 campaign in general?
Yeah, I certainly have been a Bernie Sanders supporter since his first run for the White House. And as far as I'm concerned, Senator Sanders has done more to support, amplify, embolden, electrify, and expand the left than any figure in American politics in the last century. So, you know, I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but as a Muslim, I look at Bernie Sanders as a Jew walking on water. You know, there's nothing I'm ever going to say critical of Senator Sanders. I admire him a very great deal. I wouldn't be running for Congress if he didn't show in 2016 how to do it in a way that supports social movements, and I'm very honored and proud to follow that example. I wish he stayed in. I think the country really needs him, and I think we need him only more with every passing day. And the need for his voice reveals itself in the unfortunate collapse of our economy, the collapse of our political system, the abdication of the interests of working class Americans by institutional corporate Democrats. And, you know, your points about Joe Biden are all accurate. You know, I think about Joe Biden and I think about Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. Right. You know, I have all these people running around, think about the Supreme Court. Yeah, I do think about the Supreme Court a lot. It's why I think Joe Biden, frankly, is the weakest nominee in the Democratic field. I think it's really disappointing, I dare say terrifying, that Democrats have consolidated around his candidacy in particular. He has a history of lying on the record. He has a history of losing presidential primaries. He's a very uncompelling candidate. And I do hope, you know, and one reason I find him uncompelling is that he has been the conservative voice of the Democratic Party for a generation, precisely what we don't need. And there's another lens of this. Every president that's won the White House in the last 20 years has been an outsider. George Bush was an outsider. Barack Obama was an outsider. Donald Trump was an outsider. So who do Democrats nominate in 2020? A senator who's chaired the Foreign Relations Committee and been in the Senate for 50 years, right? I mean, Bernie's been in the Senate, but he's an outside candidate. He's an outsider even while being an insider. That's the figure that America wants. That's the figure who was filling stadiums. That's the figure who raised, support from 1 million different donors. That's the figure who would win the White House if corporate Democrats weren't, as they unfortunately are, more interested in losing to Trump than they are to losing to Bernie. And I think that's very revealing. I do think that if Joe Biden wants to win the election, he's going to have to show up. And that means literally showing up, leaving his, not, I mean, he can follow the public health guidance, but he's at least got to participate in the public debate. He can't hide in his basement. And I think he also needs to embrace positions that are embraced by a majority of Americans, starting with Medicare for all. Universal health care at this point is a public health exigency. It's an imperative. And if he supports it, it will make him a stronger nominee. It will help him win the White House. If he doesn't, I fear what will happen. I'm pretty sure that the centrists can't do it alone. They demonstrated that in 2016. They demonstrated that their vision isn't enough to meet the needs of the moment. We on the left have demonstrated that more Americans, support our vision. And I'm eager to see that interest vindicated. If not in the presidential election, all I can do is win my race. And even if we can't get Bernie in the White House, I'm very eager to end Speaker Pelosi's career, to still send the signal across Washington that we need to end the bipartisan consensus on the corporate rule that is killing us en masse every day.
I want you to give us a little bit of hope. As progressives, as you just spoke about with Bernie, we lost a little bit of hope, especially with the pandemic too. A lot of people out of work, don't have jobs. They're worried about becoming homeless if they're not homeless already, and finding food to eat. Where do progressives go from here? Can you give us some hope?
Absolutely. We go local. We go to our communities. I've seen so many examples of inspiring, particularly mutual aid projects around the country. The grad student at Berkeley who's been distributing hand sanitizer at scale, thousands of bottles to unhoused people and elderly people across the Bay Area. The folks who've banded together to do pop-up food pantry delivery, both here in San Francisco. And I've seen, posts from people in many other cities around the country. I'm seeing Americans show up for each other at a time when our institutions are failing us. That's where our hope inheres, to ground into our communities and to where we can pursue local action to do that. Now, the pandemic complicates that. Many of the things we used to do, we can't do at the moment because we're all, stuck in our homes. This is a time for innovation. It's a time for connection, and it's a time to support each other. When we look at the progressive movement and the movement to defend the future, I don't like calling it progressive anymore because I feel like the term has been somewhat co-opted. I'm a democratic socialist. I'm an anti-authoritarian. I'm a future and democracy defender. And as we look at the efforts to defend our democracy, we have the wind at our backs, even if the very near term is dark. If Joe Biden is the nominee, we can rest assured that whoever is in the White House next will have a history of misogyny, a history of racial predation, a history of, quasi-legal, effective, at least corporate, if not personal corruption. And we're going to have to fight those figures, whether it's Trump or Biden, and we're going to have to fight them from the left. And when we have had targets for the left to mobilize around, we've gained a lot of ground. In the time, I think, you were referring a little while ago to the Bush administration and Nancy Pelosi's unfortunate support for so much of Bush's agenda before she started supporting so much of Trump's agenda. And I saw even in those years, I was fighting for marriage equality in the court starting in 2004. I've seen us, we, the people, us with a capital U, win things, even in dark times. And the key there is to recognize that we might be down, but we're not out by a long shot. And we don't, it's not like our quiver of arrows, to mix our metaphor here, is in any way empty. We have a million opportunities. We down ballot progressives running against entrenched incumbents around the country. There's many of us. We offer the opportunity to capture Congress and send a very loud signal to Washington. Among the things that I've proposed are ending judicial life tenure to recapture the court as an agent of justice. We have real opportunities with visionary policies like Ilhan Omar's policy to cancel the rent and suspend mortgage payments and support small landlords. We have voices out there that are fighting for our interests. And now is a time for us to rally, not just around us politicians and people that are proposing these policies in the public sphere, but specifically around our communities. Look for groups in your community that are doing important work, shout them out, support them, plug in however you can. It is at the local level when we think global and we act local, when we take local action in concert with our neighbors, the possibilities are limitless.
Shahid Buttar, can you tell us where people can find more about you, can help you out?
Thank you so much, Rob. Folks can check us out online at www.shahidforchange.us. You can also sign up to volunteer at shahid.fyi/volunteer. Visit us online. You can find us at Shahid for Change on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitch. We look really forward to hearing from any of your listeners that are interested in being part of this movement to capture Congress. We'd particularly welcome people to sign up to volunteer with us. We'd love to have your support.
Shahid, you're truly an inspirational figure, and what you just said about the local level, it was kind of like a pump-up speech for me to, if I was playing a basketball game, it really gets me excited to see people like you running, and, young people like me that are in their late 20s, we desperately need people like you to run. So I really appreciate this, and I really admire you as a young person, and a person that, I would truly want to be, growing up as, and have you in power, of course.
You
Thank
humble
so
me, brother.
much.
That's really kind of you. Thank you.
It's
I don't know
truth,
what to say.
we really need people like you, and I just lost my job too, so I'm in the same boat with a lot of people. There's people that are worse off than me, so we need this hope right now, and you really gave it to us and the viewers. So I really appreciate that.
Right on. We're all in this together, man.